and good evening, and welcome back to everyone to Basic Science Lights the Way series. I've noticed a number of regulars that have been attending, and it's great to see you all again. We had three speakers planned for tonight, but unfortunately, one of them, Phil Marcus, who's a professor of mechanical engineering at Berkeley, took ill, so he's unable to join us this evening. He was going to tell us about his longstanding research on the nature and activity of Jupiter's red spot, which is a fascinating topic. We'll try to get him back for a future Basic Science Lights the Way, maybe next season. But tonight we do have the pleasure of hearing from some of our leading scientists on campus about fluid dynamics and how fluid dynamics informs their work in mathematics and earth sciences. Fluid mechanics and dynamics are essential branches of physics and engineering that explore the behavior of fluids, whether liquids, gases, or even granular materials like sand, under various conditions, how they behave. These principles govern how fluids move, interact with surfaces, and respond to forces, playing a crucial role across a wide array of disciplines and applications. From the design of everyday products like airplanes and automobiles to understanding natural systems such as weather patterns and ocean currents, fluid mechanics is integral to the functioning of modern society. Its influence stretches across both microscopic and macroscopic scales, demonstrating the versatility and universal importance of this topic. Fluid mechanics also plays a central role in the natural sciences, particularly in environmental and geophysical contexts. Atmospheric fluid dynamics helps meteorologists predict weather patterns, including the formation of storms and climate phenomena like hurricanes. And in the earth sciences, fluid dynamics aids in the study of processes like volcanic eruptions and glacial movement, as well as the circulation of molten rock beneath the Earth's surface. Now, before we begin the program, I'd like to encourage our audience to post questions as they come into your head along the way for any of our speakers using the chat box. We are continuously monitoring the chat box, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can as we go along. With that, I want to introduce our moderator for this evening, who is Professor Per-Olof Persson in the Department of Mathematics. And he is also a mathematician, faculty scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Per-Olof's research interests are in computational methods for partial differential equations, with applications in areas such as fluid and solid mechanics. He's developed new finite element discontinuous Galerkin numerical methods, parallel preconditioners, and curved mesh generators. All of those are useful in solving complex partial differential equations. He's applied his methods to important real-world problems, such as the simulation of turbulent flow problems in flapping flight and vertical axis wind turbines, quality factor predictions for micromechanical resonators, and noise prediction for aeroacoustic phenomena. He's also an expert in presenting these highly intellectual concepts in simple and engaging ways. So let me turn it over to you, Per.
Thank you, Steve. I am excited to be here moderating tonight's event. And let me begin by laying some groundwork for this evening and give you some sense of my own research and the field that we work in. When people ask me what I do, sometimes I say just mathematics. Sometimes I would say applied mathematics. I might even say numerical analysis. But actually, a more precise term for what I do is computational science and engineering. The mathematical modeling I use can illustrate everything happening in the world, not just physics. Even things like the traffic flow in freeways can be described by so-called partial differential equations. Numerical simulations are crucial for future and current advances in engineering and science. So these are the basic scenarios where we sit down and use traditional applied mathematics to describe and get the mathematical formulation of the physical problem we want to study or engineers. So I use numerical simulation processes in research collaborations. And in the past, I've had projects together with the United States Air Force and NASA to predict airflow around airplanes or wings or other vehicles. Typically, you want to predict before you build the airplane, how it would perform, perhaps improve it before you even have to build it. So these models are very important. Of course, it is a lot of mathematics. But what I like about this field a lot is that it's also a lot of computer science, computing and programming. And of course, you apply it to physical problems and then engineering design. So you can imagine how this would be done at a company like, for example, Boeing, where optimizing designs to achieve certain objectives is crucial. Of course, our speakers tonight apply fluid dynamics to a range of problems in the earth sciences and mathematics. So now let's get underway. At the end of each talk, we will try to address all of the questions from the audience. Please add questions in the chat and join me in welcoming our first speaker, Assistant Professor in the Department of Mathematics, Franziska Weber. So Franziska Weber is an applied mathematician interested in an analysis and a numerical approximation of nonlinear partial differential equations, or PDEs, emerging in fluid dynamics, multi-phase flows, complex fluids, and mathematical biology. She combines tools from mathematical and numerical analysis and probability to design mathematically sound algorithms to simulate applications in fluid dynamics and material science. And currently, she's working on problems related to turbulence and statistical descriptions of nonlinear conservation laws.
Thank you for the nice introduction, Per, and let me share my slides. Okay, so yeah, as already pointed out by Per and Stephen Kahn, today we're talking about models for fluid dynamics, and as it was already said, such models are, for example, partial differential equations. There are others, but let's focus on these for now, since that is related to what I work on. So here are some typical examples of partial differential equations that you may have seen before. For example, we may want to get a coffee, and so we put a pot on the stove and hope that it heats up quickly so that we can drink our coffee. And a typical mathematical model for this is the heat equation, which is what you can see here in A. And then, yeah, today we will mostly talk about fluid dynamics, which is something you can see in the second picture. And the mathematical model for this is the Navier-Stokes equation. The third picture shows you an aurora or northern light. And this is an electromagnetic phenomena, and therefore a way to possibly model it is the Maxwell equations for electromagnetic waves. Yeah, so let's go to the Navier-Stokes equations. What you can see here is the compressible Navier-Stokes equations, which you may have encountered before. And basically what we have here is three physical laws. The first one is the conservation of mass. Rho is the density and v is the velocity field. And so basically it tells us that no mass is created. The second is the balance of momentum, which is basically Newton's second law. Here, P is the pressure, that's the additional variable, and I'm not going into all the details of the equations. You may already know them, and otherwise it may not help much either. The third one is the balance of energy. So E is the energy, and again, this shows us how the energy is transported through flux and stress. And the purple variable here, mu, that's the viscosity. The viscosity is inversely proportional to the Reynolds number, and there's many applications where the Reynolds number is very large, and Madison will talk more about that later. And so you could possibly think of setting mu equal to 0 since it's very small. What you would obtain then is the Euler equations, which is another way to model fluid dynamics. While it looks a little simpler if you set these complicated terms on the right-hand side here to 0, it causes other problems, mathematical problems, and that are difficult to deal with sometimes. And that is related to the emergence of turbulence. And there's actually no mathematical definition of turbulence in terms of formula and mathematical objects. However, the engineers know very well what they're talking about. And here's a typical picture. So what you can see here is the flow of air in a wind tunnel, where we visualize the streamlines. So the first dashed lines, that's where there's a grid there. And so the air flows through the grid. And first you have some nice laminar flow. And then as you can see, there's a transition region and the flow becomes turbulent and quite chaotic. So you can already like kind of guess that being chaotic could cause some trouble. Yeah, and so often what we want to do is we want to compute solutions of these equations to possibly make predictions, or as Per pointed out, figure out how to design an airplane. However, these equations, the solution of this equation are functions like the density, the velocity field, and the energy. And so they have values at every point in space and time, as you know. And so it's not always possible to find a closed form expression for that, like an exact formula. And so what we do instead is we use numerical methods to solve them. And so the general idea here is we take our domain of interest, where we would like to, maybe this could be a cube of air. Here we have just a 2D domain to simplify things a little bit, where you can see two airfoils, and then we discretize it. That means we create a mesh with triangles or other, possibly other shapes, depending on what we prefer. And so you can see here, there's all these little triangles. And then what we do is we compute an approximation of the solution in each of these triangles. So possibly we try to find it at the vertices or in the middle of the triangle, and that depends on the numerical method we choose. And so now we went from this infinite dimensional object with values at every point to a finite number of values. And we could write this in some vector form. And now what we have to solve is not a partial differential equation, but an algebraic system of equation. And that is going to be a very large system of looking at all these points, but a computer can handle that. And then, so typical questions that I as a mathematician would ask are the following. So let's denote h the mesh size. So that's the diameter of the smallest triangle here. We could also, by the way, have a mesh that has all similar triangles or squares, in which case it gets a little simpler. And then let's call UH the approximate solution that is computed on such a mesh with mesh size h. And let's call U the actual solution of the partial differential equation, or PD, which is unknown. We don't know that. And then some typical questions that we may have are, can we compute UH efficiently? Can our algorithm in the computer be solved within a reasonable amount of time, so we don't need to wait for years for it to give us a solution? And also, in particular, this is important if h gets very small and the vectors I talked about before get larger and larger. And then the second very important question is UH somehow close to the actual solution? Does it get closer as we put more and more grid points here? So as we make smaller and smaller of these triangles, we hope that it gets closer to the actual solution. But of course, we don't know the actual solution. So we may need some estimates for that. And that this is not always obvious that this error gets smaller. In this approximation procedure, I want to demonstrate to you in an example that is related to the research I do. So here we have a specific benchmark problem in fluid dynamics. It's called the Kelvin-Helmholtz problem that you may have seen before. And so what's going on here is you have 3 layers of air that are just stacked on top of each other in this way. And so one of the layers, say the middle layer, has a lower density, and the bottom and the top layer has a higher density. And then the initial velocity field, so this is the compressible Navier-Stokes equations that you have seen before. So we'll need to specify the velocity field. It's a shear flow, so it goes in one direction in one of the bands and in the other direction in the other band. And because you often have some small inaccuracies between the layers, it may not be exactly smooth, you get instabilities and like the formation of little eddies that shed off. And so that's what you get at a later time. And so this simulation is, and that happens. So here we have a grid with lots of square grid cells. So it's uniform, it's not as complicated as the one you have seen before. And in this first square, we have 128 by 128 of these squares. And then we double the number, which is what you can see in this second picture. We double it again in each dimension, and we double it again. And what you can see is that as you refine the grid, you see lots of smaller and smaller little structures appearing. And so you wonder, when is this process going to stop? And we have found all the structures so that we could say that our approximation is close to the solution. And by the way, these simulations were done by my colleague, Kjetil Lue. And here's a more excessive simulation where you have about 16,000 by 16,000 grid points, and you see there's even more small structures. And that already takes a very long time to compute it's done on a supercomputer. And so still, we don't know if we're at the end. And this can also, you can also see this in the following more mathematical plot, maybe. So here, since we don't have the exact solution, what we can do is we can compare two consecutive approximations with finer resolution and hope that as we make the mesh size smaller and smaller, they should get closer and closer so that error gets smaller, sort of like a Cauchy sequence, if you may have seen that in real analysis class. But as you can see in this example, it doesn't actually decrease the error. They seem to be at the same distance apart. So it doesn't seem that there's any convergence in this case. So we may say, oh, crap, this numerical method doesn't work. However, if you go out in the nature, you may see similar things. So qualitatively, maybe what we have is not so bad. So this is Kelvin-Helmholtz instability in the clouds. So basically what you have is layers of air that have different densities, and then the wind acts as the shear flow. And so the clouds visualize the little vortices forming. And here's another one. This is on Saturn. It's also Kelvin-Helmholtz instability. So from a qualitative point of view, what we saw is actually, it looks right. However, it's not really that we can use this for mathematical predictions necessarily, because if we do our perturbations slightly different, or we find a mesh, we get new structures. So one way to make more sense of this or formalize this mathematically is by using a probabilistic approach. So what we saw right now is we had functions. So the solution would be of the PD would be a function with a value at every point in space-time. Instead, you could look at an object which gives you a probability density at every point in space-time. So basically, instead of saying, oh, my fluid is going to act, or my density is going to be 3 at a certain point, you could say, oh, it's in a range of, maybe on average it's 3, but the range may be between 2.5 and 3.5, like some like probability distribution. And if we do that for this previous example, and like say take lots of initial data that are almost the same but slightly perturbed with respect to each other, and then compute the mean of them, we obtain a result like this. So this is the mean for different mesh resolutions. And now all the plots look a little similar, and so we could guess that there may be convergence. And actually, if you look at the Cauchy convergence that I showed you before, it does look like it converges in this case. Another thing so this is the mean. Another thing that we could do is we could pick a point in a certain area of the domain and then count how many times we get a certain value. And so this is what happens in this case for a specific point. I think it's in the upper right corner. And we see this kind of looks like some maybe probability density. And now you wonder, okay, this is quite theoretical. How is this useful for practical purposes? So it turns out that in many, that often we do have predictions like that. And for example, an example is weather forecast. And so here see the weather forecast for a certain week in April. And the black line is the expectation. And then the shaded areas are the variance, how uncertain this prediction is. And you see as time evolves, it gets more and more uncertain. And yeah, and so you see like what we actually have in practice that often looks a little bit like that. And what I do is I develop theory and algorithms to do such computations and analyze fluid dynamics. And now I would like to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Franziska. It looks like we have at least one question here from the chat, so let me start with that. So Daryl Yon is asking, what basis functions are you using? And maybe also follow up, how do you optimize the basis function complexity and the mesh fineness?
Okay, so I guess what you mean by basis functions is a specific type of numerical method, which could be like maybe a finite element method. So this particular example wasn't actually computed using a finite element method, but a finite volume method. And I guess the reason is because it's a compressible flow, it has a more wave type character. And you have conservation of mass and so on, so that's useful for that. And moreover, one could use just a grid with lots of, like a uniform grid with lots of similar grid cells. And so we don't necessarily need like a discontinuous Galerkin or finite element method.
Okay, sounds good. Let me see. So please, everyone, feel free to ask questions. I can keep on talking to Franziska while you do it. Maybe you could say a little bit about compressor. So you talked about the compressible Navier-Stokes. What does that mean that they are compressible? And the other big famous fluid equation is, of course, the incompressible one, right?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't explain that very well. So the system of equations that I've shown is the compressible Euler equations. But actually on the previous slide with the examples, I had the incompressible Navier-Stokes equations. And so basically that means the density, if it's compressible, the density can vary, and incompressible, the density doesn't vary or almost doesn't vary, like you can approximate by something that doesn't vary. And what happens if you do that, you saw maybe the equation for the conservation of mass that simplifies to just the incompressibility constraint, it's called, which means that the divergence of U is equal to 0. And the pressure will act as a Lagrange multiplier.
Sounds good. Maybe I could also quickly follow up on that. There is a very famous mathematical conjecture, right, for incompressible flow. Is that relevant for compressible? But basically one of the Clay prizes, right? The millennial prizes.
Oh.
Do you want to comment on that a little bit? Just what is it about? And
you mean about the 3D Navier-Stokes?
The existence of the Navier-Stokes solution.
So yeah, I think it's unclear. Yeah, the question is whether smooth solutions exist for, I guess, a smooth initial condition. And I think the problem is posed on the torus or the full space. I think that's the general idea, because boundaries make everything even harder. So mathematicians simplify a little bit and take the boundaries away. And so yeah, the question is whether this is the case in 3 dimensions. In 2 dimensions, one can show this for the incompressible Navier-Stokes equations. For the compressible Navier-Stokes equations, I think there's even less around or less details. In general, I think it's expected that they form shocks. And I think even in 2D, things are already quite iffy.
Yeah, exactly. So lots of math going on. Lots of unsolved math problems. All right, great. Now we're getting a lot of questions from the audience here. Let me start with Doug asking what type of computers you're using.
Oh, so the simulation that you saw was done at the Supercomputing Center CSCS in Lugano in Switzerland. For me, myself, I often do some simulations on my laptop for simpler things to figure out if something works. And then if I figure out it works, I'll do it on a supercomputer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cluster at Berkeley.
All right, let me ask you another question then from Joseph Faletti. Can you tell us anything about how the greater details of smaller branch vortices would affect how the engineers use this information?
Wait, I didn't get that. The detail?
So about how the greater details of the smaller branch vortices.
The detail.
I would probably think that, Joseph, it means that if the details of how all these little, basically your averaging process, why does it matter, basically, that all these little details in the turbulent, in the little vortices, at the end of the day, the engineer is not really interested in the particular structure of the turbulent flow, right?
No, I mean, an engineer would probably be more qualified to answer than me in this case, but
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I think it's the simulation is useful in the sense that it looks like a real fluid. You can see that it gives you what you can see in nature. So like what we're computing is not complete garbage. But yeah, like where exactly the vortex lies, I don't think that will be. I think like maybe when you're simulating an airfoil, you want to see where the turbulence forms, but not how exactly it looks. Yeah.
Right. And I would say this is much related to the next question by Ron Geiger, which is if turbulence introduces so much noise, how is it possible to make a reliable prediction?
Oh. Yeah. I guess it doesn't, like, sometimes it's not possible, but whenever we can, we still try to make predictions or do better computation.
Yeah, or like you said, the averages, right? You can maybe good averages.
I guess there's also like different, yeah, you can take average. And then there's other methods in other areas where you try to find like maybe the lower modes and filter out the higher signals and so on, if the question was related to that.
All right, maybe one last question, which is more about our classes. Roger Nake is asking if fluid mechanics is taught in physics anymore now, or is it all done in engineering? I don't know if you know, so both me and Franziska are in the math department. We don't teach any fluids, right? We used to actually a little bit, but do you know this? I know engineering has a lot of classes.
Oh, I taught the topics class on fluid dynamics,
Oh,
but yeah, I don't know about which one.
I could just chime in and say it's less common to teach it in physics departments now, more common to teach it in engineering, but certainly physicists take it wherever it's taught if they're working in the field.
Yeah. I should do one quick last question from Laura Young. If you can connect the dots between your slides and the design of airplanes. What do you think,
Okay.
Franziska?
Yeah. I guess about the example I showed. Sorry.
Yes, for example,
it was a little lagged. So I guess the example I showed was you could do something similar with the picture I showed you with the airfoil, like where you could and find the mean and the variance of the flow, and that would probably give you insight on where the flow is more laminar and where you have more turbulence, and how you should maybe redesign the airfoil too.
Makes sense. All right. Well, thank you, Franziska. And we will have another chance at the end of the session to address some more of these questions. But we should probably now move on to our next speaker this evening, Assistant Professor of Earth and Planetary Science, Madison Douglas. Madison's research seeks to understand how Earth's surface has evolved, from the first expansion of life to the present, to inform landscape management practices for a safe and sustainable future. Predicting natural hazards such as flooding and debris flows require understanding the physical processes active in rivers, hill slopes, and coastlines. And this includes traveling to collect samples, measuring natural processes, running lab experiments to make scaled-down versions of these processes using water and sentiment, looking at landscape changes through time using remote sensing, and developing novel numerical methods. Madison, thank you for joining us this evening and sharing some of the insights with us.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm just going to share my slides. And so today I'm going to be talking a bit about some research I've been doing recently, trying to understand how watersheds in the Arctic are responding to climate change. And specifically, a lot of my research focuses on river networks. So there we're thinking about very turbulent, low viscosity, incompressible flow. And in general, I'm going to be discussing some of the work I've done trying to understand how rivers that flow through permafrost affect communities around the Arctic. And so in the background of my title slide, you can see a drone photo that I took above the Kayakik River in Alaska. This is in Koyukon Athabascan territory. So just to give a bit of background, I know everyone here probably knows a ton about fluids, but maybe not quite as much about permafrost. So in general, permafrost is ground that has been below 0 degrees C for at least 2 years, and it's really widespread. So if you look at the top-down map on your right, all the purple areas are where you have permafrost in the northern hemisphere, and it includes about 25% of the land area there. And if we look at a cross-section of a landscape that contains permafrost in the upper left, so you have these light-colored regions are the frozen zones, and then the darker orange are thawed layers. And at the top, similar to how ground in many places freezes and thaws, the same thing happens above permafrost. So you have an active layer that annually freezes and thaws. And then if you look at this diagram a bit more closely, you'll notice all these things that are labeled tolics. And this is where groundwater flow or surface water flow is able to advect heat through the landscape and keep the ground thawed all year round. So that's what I've been focusing on, is how rivers influence permafrost. And in general, the Arctic has some really, really large river systems. So collectively, all of the rivers that flow through permafrost regions transport about 10% of fresh water to Earth's oceans. And on the left, you can see a top-down view of the major watersheds. In North America, we have the Yukon and Mackenzie, and then there's a lot of large rivers in Siberia as well. And there's been growing interest in this topic in recent decades because Arctic rivers and landscapes are really important in the global carbon cycle. So permafrost contains about 1.5 times the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And as permafrost is thawing due to landscape processes and erosion, as well as thickening of the active layer, we are having more carbon that's being eaten by microbes living in the soil or in the water and released as carbon dioxide or methane to the atmosphere. And so the concern is that this can provide a positive feedback on climate change, as more thaw releases more greenhouse gases, which ends up causing more thaw as the climate warms. Okay, so what other things are important about permafrost and permafrost waterways? So in general, this is not just a global problem from the carbon cycle standpoint, this is also a very local problem. So there are many communities in Alaska and across the Arctic that are at risk of permafrost thaw causing ground collapse, bank or coastal erosion, and flooding. So this is one example of a news article on the right side talking about the village of Newtok in Alaska, which has been forced to relocate entirely as the village is being eroded into the river. In addition, permafrost contains a really amazing record of human history. So when people were crossing over the Bering Strait, a lot of the Arctic actually didn't have glaciers on it, and different animals, and including their remains, were preserved in permafrost and have been mummified. So I just have a couple pictures of some of the most spectacular examples here. One is a dire wolf puppy, which was preserved in ice for 57,000 years. And then another is my favorite, Nunchoga, which is big animal baby in Trundaquichin. And this was an amazing find of a completely mummified baby mammoth that was discovered a couple of years ago in the Yukon Territory. So there's an important kind of human heritage that's preserved in permafrost as well. And finally, one of the reasons that I'm interested in this from a fluid dynamics standpoint is that our models of how rivers behave at present and in the future are really poor, and this means that our hazard predictions are not good. So you'll notice that on the map on the left, Juneau, Alaska, it has been marked green as being at really low risk for flooding. But if you've been paying attention to the news the past couple of years, the last 2 summers, they've had really bad floods. And there's been some spectacular footage on national media of houses being eroded into the river. So clearly we need to improve our knowledge of these processes so that we can make better predictions for the people living there. Okay, so the question I've been focusing on recently is trying to understand if permafrost riverbank erosion rates will increase as the climate warms. And this is a bit tricky because every river on Earth tends to erode its banks and migrate across its floodplain. So you can see on the left a time lapse from Google Earth Engine. This is from 1984 to 2020. And this is showing migration of a tributary to the Amazon in Peru. And the spatial scale is 10 kilometers. So you can see that this river is migrating really quickly, up to a couple kilometers per decade. So if we go to the Arctic, people have hypothesized that permafrost should slow down how fast rivers can erode. And this is a problem because if the permafrost thaws, then potentially rivers will erode more rapidly. So on the right, I have a photo where a house used to be, and you can see some of the power lines and plumbing that used to go to the house before it got eroded into the river. So this has pretty immediate implications for people living in Arctic watersheds. Okay, so how do we try to tackle this problem? So when we go out to the Arctic and observe riverbanks, we noticed there were kind of two regimes that we could divide the processes eroding the bank into. So the first is thaw-limited permafrost erosion, where we have the rate of heat transfer from the river water to the bank is setting our erosion rate. So we can't pick up and move bank material downstream unless we've thawed it first. And the second one is sediment entrainment limited erosion. So this is a case where we are able to transfer heat from the flowing fluid to the bank much more rapidly than we can pick up and move sediment downstream. And you can see a cartoon of this as well as some of my colleagues standing on a pile of thawed riverbank sediment in the photo in the lower right. And so depending on which of these processes is happening quickly versus slowly, we'll have whatever the slower one is limit the rate that we erode our riverbanks. Okay, so how does this compare to what we observe? To test out this theory and refine this kind of conceptual model into a mathematical theory, we have to take a bunch of measurements to actually constrain those. And so some of those measurements we can do in the field by looking at actual rivers and taking samples of water and bank sediment. In some cases, we want to run experiments to understand what will happen in the Arctic, for example, if river water temperatures warm. And then what we can do is take these results and develop numerical models that allow us to predict how bank erosion rates occur at present and how they'll respond to the future. So I'm going to now compare some of our observations to what our models say. So this is a paper published by one of my colleagues, Emily, and what she did is look at peak erosion rates along given river bends compared to the maximum permafrost extent in the banks. And she demonstrated that as you increase the amount of permafrost in your banks, you tend to have much lower erosion rates. So we do seem to be at least partially limited by how fast we can thaw our banks. What we can do then is take our models we developed for thaw and entrainment limited erosion. These are mathematical models. I'm not showing you the equations, but it's just considering the bank material and the river hydraulics, as well as a bunch of parameters that quantify heat transfer between the river and the banks. And we can make a prediction of what the erosion rate should be throughout a given year with a thaw-limited model and entrainment-limited model, and then if we combine the two and take the minimum of them. And what we see if we compare this to actual measurements of erosion rates is that the combined thaw and sediment entrainment model works quite well. And so this seems to do a good job in modeling how quickly rivers should erode at present and then as the climate changes. Okay, so what's going to happen in the future? So across the Arctic, people have observed that there's generally increasing river water discharges and temperatures. And based on our models, we predict that this should increase bank erosion rates across the Arctic. We've also seen longer open water seasons, so less time when the rivers are completely frozen over, and this will mean you have more days per year where you can have erosion occurring. And communities are already adapting to some of these changing river conditions by changing when they're hunting and fishing, altering some of their travel pathways because a lot of people get around in the winter by snowmobiling over frozen rivers, or even moving themselves. So these are kind of real things that are happening, and we hope that our modeling can help communities adapt a bit more efficiently. And then finally, the carbon fluxes from Arctic landscape change are a large uncertainty. And so I've been working with some collaborators to try and address this, but this is one of the main topics that I'm hoping to work on while I'm at Berkeley. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Madison. So we now have a few minutes for questions. And let me see what we have in the chat. From Darlion, asking if people still use dimensionless parameters like Reynolds numbers to determine applicability of thaw limited or erosion limited. And maybe I could also say, does plotting data non-dimensionally help?
Yeah, it does. So doing things non-dimensionally is like a huge benefit for us. It's actually what allows me to run experiments in small scale in flumes and be able to scale it up to large scales. So when I design experiments, what I often do is make sure we have Reynolds numbers that are appropriate, and then we also look at a particle Reynolds number. So basically, what is the size of turbulent eddies relative to the sediment that we're moving? There's also a dimensionless parameter called the Froude number that is the speed that shallow water waves propagate versus how fast our flow is going. And so if you've ever been like whitewater rafting, that's a case of Froude number greater than 1. And you can even have, when people surf on standing waves, you get standing waves at Froude number equals 1. So we do a lot of non-dimensional scaling to make sure that kind of our small scale experiments and what we see in rivers are applicable, and then that allows us to compare between the two when we plot on non-dimensional axes.
All right, well, all right, we have a question from Marshall Byrne. If you can measure erosion or permafrost loss from satellite imagery.
Yeah, so some of the data I plotted is actually from a recent paper that Emily did. And so erosion tends to be up to 10 meters a year. So you're starting to push the lower limits of what you can do with satellite imagery. So, the best that we have access to is about half a meter pixel size. So you can directly measure that with satellite imagery, and that's something that we use to compare. For determining permafrost from satellite imagery, that actually gets really hard because often what people are looking at is the vegetation. So when you have the surface of the ground very close to the permafrost, there's very little room for tree roots to grow, and water tends to pond at the surface. And so you often end up with just these huge bogs full of bugs. And you tend to get different vegetation in places that have permafrost near the surface versus places that don't. So when people make those maps, usually they're basically mapping vegetation and not whether permafrost is actually there. So that can be a bit tricky because in some cases they tend to be really biased. Yeah.
Okay, cool. More question from Rishi Chopra. If science can help us to manage the geopolitical consequences of permafrost loss or erosion, for example, increased Arctic resource exploitation?
That's a tricky one. I think my science is already really impacted by geopolitics. There's the Arctic is seeing a huge increase in the amount of research that's funded there, in part because it's such a geopolitically problematic area. I know I recently went to the International Conference on Permafrost, and there were no Russian scientists there, which if you look at the map of where permafrost is globally, you'll know that that's a huge missing piece. And there's a lot of political tension that's really damaging the amount of science that can actually get done. I think on the flip side, there are some positive signs. One is that there's been a real drive to have scientists engage in constructive ways with the indigenous communities that are in the Arctic in the last decade or two. Particularly in the Canadian Arctic, they have these like amazing positions where people are tribal community members are land guardians, which is like the coolest job I've ever heard of. And they actually are conducting their own scientific research to help more effectively manage their lands, because they are also managing a lot of the natural resources that have the potential, the option to exploit or not to exploit. So recently there's been a lot of controversy in Western Alaska because one of the largest zinc mines in the world is on tribal land. So it's definitely a complicated place to work, and kind of my hope as a scientist is to give people better tools to make decisions that are consistent with their values.
Wow, so it sounds like the answer was yes. A lot of maybe it doesn't manage it, but it certainly involves it a lot. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
All right, I have more questions for you from another from Daryl Yarn here. If these techniques can be used to suggest how water used to flow on Mars?
Yeah, so there's been some work on that before. I think it's kind of an open question whether or not rivers have different width to depth ratios in permafrost versus not in permafrost. Having a equation that's a closure for channel width is actually an open question in Earth surface processes. And when we look at rivers on Mars, what you often see is the remains of a channel that was deposited, and then all the material around it was eroded. And so it's called inverted topography. And the easiest thing to measure from that is the channel width. And so it's kind of ironic that we have the least knowledge about the thing that we have the most information on Mars. But yeah, it's definitely something I've thought about. And you see evidence of sinuous rivers on Mars that look just like ones on Earth. And so they likely are following the same rules.
All right. Okay, here's a question from Sonia Mahini about numerical methods versus analytical models. She says, when I was a director at an environmental consulting firm, a lot of time analytical models can work wonders to simulate chemical concentrations and migration, and I did not need numerical methods. Are there any good analytical models for this purpose? I'm assuming, meaning your applications. How much can you do some of this work without numerics or?
Yeah, so we use kind of a mix of numerical models and analytical models. At least, so the river I was showing pictures of is like a couple 100 meters wide and 12 plus meters deep. And so even making a grid to run a numerical model, let alone getting enough data to constrain one, is really challenging. And so usually I use simplifications of the fluid dynamics of the Navier-Stokes equations that are incompressible for shallow flow. So it's the Saint-Venant equations. And there are a bunch of analytical solutions to those that work quite well. So whenever possible, I like to solve something analytically, at least to give myself an intuition for it, and then go to a numerical model if there's not a closed form solution or I need to do something in more detail.
Okay, excellent. And before I continue with some more questions, let me say that we have about 10 minutes left. So I wanted to tell everybody that we're happy to invite Franziska back as well and do a joint discussion here if you ask any questions that are related to the larger picture of fluid dynamics. But please feel free to put them in the chat. And in the meantime, I'll ask some questions that seem more specific to Madison to continue with this exciting topic here. So Edwin Cheng is asking, how different would the southern hemisphere be from the Arctic? Is the amount of tundra very different in the north and the south?
Yeah, so the main difference in the southern hemisphere is that you have fewer really large land masses that have continental climates. And so places that tend to be pretty dry and have really extremely cold winters are where you tend to get permafrost. But there's lots of mountain permafrost in the Andes, and there's actually some really amazing examples of permafrost that are in the high regions of the Atacama. That you get all sorts of weird things because it's such a low moisture environment and so cold. And there is permafrost in Antarctica. So the U.S. base at McMurdo, there's a river nearby that called the Onyx, and I've read a whole bunch of papers on it and would love to go one day. But it's a really cool example, and all of the physics and fluid dynamics that I've been talking about works there too. You just have way less life in general.
Oh, exciting. Okay, I'll continue here from Ron Geiger. How far back in time can permafrost be dated? Can the amount of carbon in the atmosphere in these prehistoric times be determined from permafrost samples to help estimate what comes next for the current climate crisis?
Yeah, so the oldest permafrost we have in North America is a couple 100,000 years. So we start not being able to do radiocarbon dating particularly well beyond about 60,000 years. And so you start having to use other isotopes, but the same idea, to get older ages. But yeah, it goes back really far. And in general, some of the big times that people have looked at to try to get some understanding of what's going on now is during past deglaciations. So one of the big questions is, if you have permafrost thawing, how much of the carbon is going to be released as methane versus CO2, which have just different lifetimes in the atmosphere. So methane is like a stronger greenhouse gas, but tends to get destroyed by sunlight pretty quickly. CO2 tends to last a bit longer. And so people have been doing a lot of studying of both permafrost and then also air bubbles and ice cores that they take in Antarctica to try and understand during previous times where you've lost a bunch of glaciers, what drove climate change then. So it's there's some really cool data sets from that.
All right. Harold Beebe is asking if saying that river to bank heat transfer is analyzed here, but sunlight to bank is also a possibility. Is this important?
Yeah, it totally is. So when we were starting this project, we did a bunch of back of the envelope calculations to try and see what the most rapid ways to transfer heat are. And you end up getting just due to water being more dense, and then differences in viscosity, you get much higher heat transfer from water than air. And just kind of a more intuitive answer to that is, if you look at one of the pictures I showed had a big niche cut into the bank, and usually those record high water. So if you have a flood, you'll have water thawing back a couple meters further than the air does. So in general, most of the large erosion events are actually caused by the water thawing back, causing a big overhang that eventually collapses.
Wow. All right, thank you so much. We do have a question for Franziska. Do you model oceanic flows as well as atmospheric, or are they very different? And I think you're mute.
Oh, I'm not sure I know that. I'm not sure I know that. So I would say what I do is maybe more related to flows in air, and I think they are connected, but I think maybe in oceanic flows there's more other parameters. They may be different. Yeah, sorry.
Sounds good. And maybe I could, just in terms of the group, it would be nice to have a little connection. I think it's just my observation here is that obviously Madison's work is very applied, and Franziska, you work more on looking at the properties and numerical methods. But in terms of connection, maybe I can ask you, Franziska, if you look at all these applications here, and I know because I work in a similar field to you that our mathematical problems of just simple turbulence of the standard Navier-Stokes equations seems so limited compared to all these issues. I mean, just to name a few, Madison would have to deal with very complex geometries and all models of the permafrost and different, and of course it's oceanic and whatever else is going on. Do you have any observation of that? I mean, what's the role of mathematics here to try to, if we can only try to provide examples on such simplified models, will it really help for the real applications if their examples are so much more complex, right? What do you see as the role of what we do?
I think maybe Madison knows better how useful math for her is than I. But my guess is that while we have some sort of toy models, like maybe we develop a numerical method for a toy model and we can actually prove stuff for that toy model, but you can still like use similar heuristics to design a numerical method that can be used for something more complicated where, yeah, you have in addition maybe ice and permafrost and like complicated topography of the river and so on. Or yeah, like, I mean, sometimes maybe you don't use a numerical method because yeah, it's too large, but you can do some simplifications, and then if you like do some mathematical analysis of these simplifications, you can figure out, like, maybe you can show that, oh, I'm ignoring this term, but the two solutions are kind of close. So these are things that mathematicians can do. So they're like, okay, yeah, I can use this simple model where I can get an exact solution.
Yeah, that makes sense. And certainly in the past, there's been very good communication between numerical, all the methods that are used by applied people have been designed by numerical analysts, etc. So it certainly makes a lot of sense. All right, so we're coming to a close here. Maybe one quick last question from Edwin Ching. In surface flows, and let's see who this is for. Well, whoever wants to answer. In surface flow systems, how critical is the smoothness of the surface? For example, of feathers or fur on a swimming mammal? Anyone feels they want to?
I'm happy to answer that. I mean, it's
Why don't you go ahead?
really, yeah, the smoothness of the surface is really critical. So that's in every single fluid equation I use, or we're thinking about conservation of momentum, you have to have some coefficient for drag or friction of your surface. So for me, it's normally if I'm thinking of like water flowing through a channel and there's huge sand dunes on the bottom of the channel, then I would be, I would use a roughness scaling that's proportional to the height of the dunes. But if I was like an otter swimming around, then I would be worried about the drag on my fur. So yeah, it's really important.
Makes sense that it has a lot of influence. All right, I think it's time to wrap up. But once again, thanks to both of you for these enlightening presentations. And to close, I'm going to hand the floor back to Stephen Kahn, Dean of the Division of Mathematical and Physical Sciences. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Per, and for moderating, and a special thanks to Madison and Franziska for the fascinating presentations and very enlightening discussion that we had afterward. As we wrap up our 9th season of Basic Science Lights the Way, I want to thank you all for making the series what it is. Your continued curiosity and support drives what we do here, and we couldn't be more grateful. Please reach out if you'd like to learn more about anything we've covered. We will be sharing additional resources with you by email about our speakers and ways you can support their great work. A video of today's session will also be available at our Basic Science Lights the Way website approximately 2 weeks from now. You can always return to the Basic Science Lights the Way website to watch any of the episodes over the years that you've missed. With that, we hope you have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. Until next time, stay curious, fiat lux, and go Bears. Thanks very much.